Hi, Kairos. Good evening. My name's Maggie, and I'm going to do our scripture reading for today. Today, we're going to be looking at Hebrews 10. This is verses 19 through 25. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have boldness to enter the sanctuary through the blood of Jesus, he has inaugurated for us a new and living way through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed in pure water. Let us hold on to the confession of our hope without wavering, since he who promised is faithful. And let us watch out for one another to provoke love and good works, not neglecting to gather together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day approaching. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good evening, Kairos. It is good to be with y'all tonight. If we haven't met yet, my name's Cameron. I am the pastoral resident here at Kairos. It is good to be with you guys again, getting to preach to you all and share a message. Mike cannot be here tonight. He is on a ministry trip over to Texas, but he sends his love. He wishes he could be here, and he's excited to be here next week. If you're new here, we just want to say welcome. Again, as we talked a little bit or heard Adele share in the baptism service, our goal here is to accomplish our mission as the church, to engage the whole person with the whole gospel, anywhere, anytime, and with anybody. If you're here, we're excited that you're here. If you're new here, thank you for joining us. We're at a little bit of an impasse in our series right now that we're walking through. We just finished a series called Jesus, Friend of Sinners, and we're about to start a new one. And so tonight, as we talk a little bit about Hebrews and the text that we're in, we have an opportunity, I think, to talk about something that might be a little bit heavier, a little bit more in-depth, but maybe something that I think a lot of us are talking through or working through right now have heard before, and that's the idea of the de-churched. Maybe that term's new to you right now. Maybe you've heard the unchurched before. What does it mean for someone to be unchurched? It's someone who is not engaged with the gospel yet, someone who is under-churched or under-engaged. The de-churched is different. The de-churched is someone who has maybe grown up a believer, grown up in church, grown up believing a certain thing, a part of a certain community, and then for one reason or another, they've ended up walking away from that community, that denomination, that tradition, or that faith that they had originally. I think if I took a poll of this room, everybody in here would either be able to say that they've walked through a season where they've either deconstructed faith or questioned faith, or they know someone currently walking through that process right now. This is not an uncommon thing. It's not a new thing. But it's also something that is much more prevalent right now, and maybe we're seeing highlighted more often than ever. I think it's important for us to go to Scripture with that, to not neglect to talk about what we're seeing, but take it to the Word and see what does Jesus have to say about the topic of the de-church, those that are walking away from the church. And as I was preparing for this lesson, I thought of a story that was told to me a while ago. God knows if it's true, but I think it is. Story of a guy by the name of Tom, allegedly. And Tom was undergoing some renovations on his house. He and his wife had a really great year and started building up all sorts of ideas in their head about how they can make their house newer and better. And they start renovating their home and pulling out all the stops. Again, they dream up that the amazing kitchen that you've probably seen at some people's houses, the one that you don't think should be used for cooking, it's purely art, with like Asgardian plate countertops, or a microwave that you think isn't really a microwave and it's probably illegal to cook a Hot Pocket in, if you ask yourself. With the library that it looks like it belongs in a fairy tale, with the backyard that, if you're honest, you think might be prettier than you. And as they're building up all of these dreams, hard times hit. He starts getting into some financial troubles. He starts overworking. He's exhausted. And eventually, their marriage takes a hit, and Tom's wife actually ends up leaving him. And mid-house transformation, he's left in the middle of half-made dreams and a half-accomplished vision with disappointment. He has a chance to rebuild. He tries a couple times and just doesn't make it, doesn't finish it up, and then he decides it's better just to sell the house. When his real estate agent asks why he's moving, he says, I had countless years of a great life, and in the span of 1 year, all of that's been painted over. And honestly, if you asked me to stay another night in the house, I don't think I could. I can't see the life that was there before. And if I'm honest, I don't believe in ghosts, but the house feels like it's haunted. I think that sentiment is one that lands with a lot of our friends that have walked away from the church. Maybe they've had plenty of great years, but eventually something happens, whether it's church hurt or disillusionment or doubts that don't seem to go away. And eventually there's so much tied to the building now that it's too painful to walk back in, they think. Maybe you're in this room tonight and you feel that way. Maybe you're here in between churches or trying to find something to hold on to because you haven't given up on Jesus, but it's really tough right now. And if you're here and you're thinking that tonight, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here to overhear this conversation. Hear me when I say this. Jesus loves you, is glad that you're here, is for you, and is faithful to you. And that is what we want to be as well. With that being said, tonight's going to be more of a family discussion. I want to talk to us as Kairos, as a gathered body of believers, about how we can interact with people who are walking away from church, trying to find Jesus, but they're not sure where, when, or how they're going to do that. For one reason or another, whether it's deconstruction or whether it's hurt, they're looking for Jesus in a place they haven't been. And we interact with them. There are friends, there are coworkers, there are family members. And it's a tricky thing to figure out, how do we respond when someone is walking through this season? And the thing is, I think Hebrews actually gives us a glimpse as to how to do that. So a couple of things real quick before we start jumping in. I want to define our terms before we start running through them. I used two words, church hurt, and I used deconstruction. If you haven't heard those terms yet, I'm sure there's a social media post that you should check out on your timeline right now that would love to tell you. And they're really tricky terms to walk through, but I want to give a basic glimpse of what they could be defined as. The first is this: deconstruction, simply put, is just the systematic dismantling or analysis of traditions, cultures, and beliefs that someone has grown up in before. That's a very broad definition. And the thing is, if you ask somebody else, they might have a completely different definition than what I just gave. It's very broad. And so an important question when someone uses that term is, what do you mean by that? Because it can mean something different for everyone else. For our purposes tonight, that's what we're talking about. It's basically looking at theology, interpretation, culture in Christianity and asking two questions. Is this true? And is this good? And fundamentally, that is what it is. What deconstruction does not mean, and what de-churched does not mean, is non-believer. Those are not synonyms. Those are not the same thing. Sure, you might have seen or know someone that had gone through a deconstruction process and ended up walking away from the faith, or deconstructing the core of the gospel as part of their faith, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But for most, at least from what I've seen and what I've gathered, deconstruction at the very least starts with breaking down what they grew up with the hopes of building back again to find a new faith, a faith that was stronger than what they were questioning before. Second is church hurt. It's the other side of the de-churched group. I think this one requires less explanation. I think we all kind of know what that looks like, and we know it from stories. One of the great tragedies of our world is that it has fallen, and with fallen and sinful people comes wounding. So when I say church hurt, I'm not talking about ideas, I'm talking about stories of people. I'm talking about my friend in Orlando who endured physical and sexual abuse. I'm talking about my pastor friend who lost his position because his wife had an affair and left him. I'm talking about a friend of mine that heard from church that God hated and did not condone his marriage because it was between two people of different races. I'm talking about friends that didn't feel comfortable talking about their sexuality because they thought that they would be kicked out of church immediately, and they weren't wrong. I'm talking about a worship friend that was told that his anxiety and his depression didn't present the right image. And so he'll probably need to step down from the team. Those are the things that I'm talking about. Those are the people in mind as we talk. And the thing is, if I ask any one of you in this room, you probably have stories of your own or stories of people that you care about. And that's the thing about the de-churched, is that oftentimes when we're talking about those topics, maybe you think of deconstruction and it unsettles you a little bit. Maybe you think of church hurt and your investigator side comes out and you want to figure out what really happens, and things agitate us in the heart. And we want to fix something, we want to point to truth, we want to do something that can solve the issue, when in reality, it's not about dissension from belief most of the time. It's not an intellectual thought of, I don't agree with this anymore. More often than not, it's about doubt. There's a book by Kurt Thompson called The Soul of Shame, and he talks about doubt, which we talked about a few weeks ago. And he says, first and foremost, doubt isn't intellectual, doubt is relational. And the opposite of doubt is not faith, it's not thinking or agreeing. The opposite of doubt is trust. For the de-churched, it is not about thinking something is right, it is about trust. Can I trust the church again? Can I trust Jesus again? Can I trust my friends, my family, my pastor? Can I trust the Bible? It's about trust. And doubting is a tricky thing because we're called to faith, but doubting is reaching for faith that you don't have. You're grasping for something that isn't there, and it feels like you're free-falling potentially. There's nothing to hold on to. And the interesting thing is that doubt is countered by trust, and trust is only built through faithfulness. Through us being together and showing and building trust and saying that there is something trustworthy to hold on to. Jesus is trustworthy, and so can the church. You can trust the body again. And so, again, that brings us to Hebrews chapter 10, which Maggie read for us a second ago. The writers of Hebrews encourage us towards the end not to abandon the meeting. Focusing in on verse 22, it says, let us draw near with a true heart full of assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Simply put, we've been redeemed. Let us draw near. Verse 23, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. Holding true to promises is what we're talking about. Because he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another in good works and love, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. So the writer of Hebrews here is hearing the same things, and he's making the interesting point of saying that clinging to the promises of Jesus and love and encouragement are the foundations of staying together as the body. When people want to leave, when they feel not safe, that the church isn't trustworthy, when they feel like they're better off elsewhere, Hebrews is telling us that love and Jesus are the antidote somehow. Now, here's the thing. We often come face to face with other people's doubts and wounds. We often come face to face with people who are struggling or walking through these similar seasons, and we don't know how to help. We think that fear is understandable and a healthy response, but maybe we've seen some things that have scared us. One too many people walk away from the faith when they started doubting. One too many people use the term deconstruction, and it didn't end well. There was no reconstruction afterwards. And if they're loved ones, we start thinking the worst, and we start giving into fears. We're worried because we don't know where this journey is going to walk our friend. We hear their hurts and their wounds, and we're worried that those might not heal. I mean, we hear hard questions or theology that we disagree with, and it concerns us. And those are valid concerns, but sometimes those fears can actually cause us to do things that might not help the situation, right? Have you ever heard someone sharing these things and something riles you up inside and you end up being a little more combative and defensive than you initially anticipated? A conversation that you were having that somehow goes south and you didn't intend it to, but all of a sudden you're talking to someone and you're proving your point rather than talking to them. You're talking at them or over them. You stop listening and you start speaking. And then somehow you walk away wondering what happened there. I think that's one of the worst parts about the de-church movement is I call it a movement very loosely. There's a moment where someone takes 2 steps away from church and then they have a really rough encounter with a believer that sends them miles down the road. And all of a sudden we start wondering, how am I supposed to engage with that? Maybe you were the one that said something and you keep wondering, was that my fault? How do I show the love of Jesus to this person? Instead of making them feel like they're other and a part of another tribe, how do I interact with that? And I think the bottom line is this. Listen, Jesus has invited us all to a table, right? Regardless of what your current theology is, if you say Jesus is Lord and you believe in his life, death, and resurrection, and that is your salvation, you are invited to the same table as everyone else. And right theology that we want to share with people is important. And hopefully correcting things that might be a little askew in perspective is important. But ultimately the thing that keeps you sitting at the table is what Hebrews says, love. Love is what keeps you at the table. It is not the right opinion, because that didn't even get you invited down. It is not flawless theology, because none of us would stand. It is love, grace, humility, faithfulness that keeps us sitting at the table together. So the question is, how do we do that? If gathering is the value and encouragement and love is what we do, how do we bring those two things together? We look at verse 33 saying, hold to our confession, right? Why is meeting important? Because we're holding to our confessions and our promises together. The value is not merely, all right, how do we interact and be nice at the table, but how do we contend with one another at the table? What are the promises that I can hold on to with somebody else, for somebody else, when doubt is making it difficult for them to hold on? It's not our faithfulness that's the glue. In verse 23, it says this, let us hold fast because he who promised is faithful. So how do we point to Jesus? When our flawed theologies are not enough, we rely on the fact that Jesus is the faithful one. And there's this shift that happens that we see. Don't neglect, don't abandon the gathering. The counter given is love and encouragement. Better yet, other versions say we have to entice, to irritate, provoke love and good works from somebody else. How do you provoke that? How do you poke at someone or something until love comes out? Well, honestly, it's by loving them. That's the mechanism by which we create love and faithful relationship, is by loving first. How do we watch out for each other? How do we bring and win somebody back into a church setting, make them feel comfortable and that they can trust? It's giving them something to trust, giving them faithfulness to point to. And the continued coming together at the table is not fueled by arguments won. So don't hear me when I say this to say, don't speak prophetically, don't speak words of truth. That's not what I'm saying. Those are valuable and necessary parts of the conversation. A part of loving is speaking honestly and speaking truth. The thing is, we can kind of really fall in love with the truth holder and truth fighter part of Jesus, which is good, without also holding the whole person of Jesus together, which also includes faithfulness even when someone might be in the wrong. One of the most remarkable things about Jesus is that he is faithful to you despite the fact that you do not think about him perfectly. And if that's the case, we should win, or we should fight just as much to speak truth as we do being faithful to somebody, even if we disagree. So how do we do that? Tonight, if we're talking about how to love those who feel unloved and out of place, what are ways to do that? Again, we're calling people to engage with church again that might have valid reasons to not trust. And the goal is creating intergenerational, honest, faithful friendships. How do you solve distrust? Relationship. So how do you beckon people back into relationship? How do you build trust with them to hopefully help them build trust with the church, with the body again? When we're hurt in a relationship, we can rarely heal outside of relationship. So if the win is being the body together, not neglecting to meet, not abandoning the coming together, how do we do that? I don't fully know. This is where I'm a little lost. I've done it wrong a lot of times. I've said the wrong thing a lot of times. I've talked with some of the friends that I spoke about at the front of the sermon and said the wrong thing. So understand that I'm coming with humility and also looking and asking questions. If biblical community is built and not found, I'm a novice at building it. But there are a few things that I think might be helpful. So hear me when we walk into this final part. There's not an authoritarian position I'm taking from. These are hard-won lessons. And most of these things we're about to talk about are things I've heard from people who are de-churched. Again, one of the best things that we can do is listen more than we speak. And so take this as a gift from lessons hard-earned and hard listened to as we walk into this. What we're going to do is we're going to talk through 10 quotes. 5 that maybe are unhelpful and 5 that are helpful. When you're talking with someone who's de-church, who's gone through church hurt, who's gone through deconstruction, here's 5 things that these are real people that they have heard someone speak this to them, and they said, it might be true, but it did not help me. And then here are 5 other things that maybe we can talk about. Now, one quick point before we walk in. If you said one of these things, let's combat the shame and the guilt right now. This is not a point of condemnation for you. If you said one of the things that wasn't helpful, take a breath. No one's here to throw a stone. It's okay, because I've probably said them at one point too. The thing that we can rely on is the fact that this is an opportunity for maybe a new conversation, something that is a little more fruitful and can help heal more than we hurt. So 5 quotes, really quick. The first one's this: unhelpful, I don't see that, Are you sure that's accurate? If you're in conversation with someone who's talking about church hurt, talking about deconstruction, maybe you've thought it was a helpful thing to say, I don't think that's true. I don't see that. Are you sure? It sounds helpful. Maybe you're confronting and trying to push for truth. That is true, and that's a good thing. What it might give off more than you expect is, I don't think your perspective is trustworthy. I don't think what you're saying is right. At worst, I think you're lying. Why are you lying? Here's something that you can alternatively say that might be difficult. A helpful thing. I hear you and I believe you. This might feel like a betrayal for some of us in the room. This might feel like, I'm not trying to lie to them. Well, here's the thing, especially when you're dealing with someone who's wounded or experienced hurt, believing them first builds trust. And until there's a reason not to believe, if this person has been trustworthy before, they're probably not lying or making it up now. And one thing you can believe is that they believe what they told you. And so it is enough for you to say, I hear you and I believe what you were telling me. And if follow-up needs to happen, and it rarely does, but if follow-up needs to happen to verify, okay. But what builds a bridge rather than pushes away is I hear you and I believe you. It means that you're associating with them, that you're with them, that you're not an enemy to what they feel has happened to them. The next one is this. It's not as bad as it might feel right now. Oh, you're going through something? Listen, man, it's not as bad as you think. It's okay. It sounds like it's encouraging, but in reality, it's minimizing. In reality, it pushes down. At worst, it feels like you're explaining to them how they should feel. Instead, maybe you could say this, that's awful. I'm sorry you went through that. I'm hurting for you. It shows that your heart's not callous to what's happening and that you're not just in the conversation, you're feeling what they're feeling and you love enough to hurt with them. That's Jesus weeping. That's arms locked together. The next one is this. The Bible is clear on this. You shouldn't have to question it. Again, it might feel like you're standing for truth. On the other side, it might feel like a punch in the gut. Because what you're saying is, this is clear and obvious. Why don't you get it? Here's the thing, if someone's questioning it, it might not be as obvious as you think. It might not be as clear and hard as you think. Now, there are hard truths. I'm not saying that's not the thing. But to say, this is easy, basically, don't talk is to say, your questions and your doubts aren't welcome here. Believe. Counter with this. I would love to listen to your story or your questions. Let's talk about it. One of the worst things that a person who's de-churched can feel is that their questions are not welcome in church. That they need to clean it up and get it together and figure out their answers beforehand, when that's probably the worst thing that they could do. Questions should be welcome here. So tell them. I want to hear it. A couple more. The last one, or second to last, is, are you certain you have no fault here? Yeah, I'm hearing all of this, but let's consider, what did you do wrong? I know you were hurt, or I know there are things that you're pointing out, but what about you? Hang on. Were you taken more than you were giving at church at the time? Were you a little too passive? Maybe you were hanging out with the wrong group. Again, it sounds like conviction, but actually it's blame shifting. And whataboutism. I know what you're saying, but what is this? I know what you're saying, but let's all be fair. And it sounds like at the worst, we're avoiding accountability and trying to be combative. Counter with this. There's no correct thing for me to say here. What do you need me to be? Who do you need me to be? Instead of trying to fix and solve the issue and make everything kosher again, it's okay to just sit and listen. Who do you need me to be? How can I help? And you can go from there. And the last thing is this, and I think this is really important. Saying things like, hey, don't drag this out too long. It's not healthy to keep doubting. Again, it sounds like you're pushing them towards health. In reality, what they might be hearing is, hey, if this keeps going, I don't know how much longer I'm walking with you. Hey, this is a lot, and it's been a minute. We need to wrap this up. I think you're just being selfish at this point. The person that you're talking to probably doesn't enjoy the phase that they're in right now. And they're probably looking for people to be faithful. Again, we're building trust here. So this is, I think, one of the most important things that we can say to a friend. I'm committed to walking through this with you. It might be 3 years. It might be 10. It might be a week. But just saying, hey, you have an ally that's not conditional upon how this resolves and also how long it takes to get there. I'm committed. That's language of Jesus. So as we wrap up tonight, here's the thing. We can take heart in a few things. One, I know that we're struggling and contending for people that we know. And it's a scary thing to do, to watch and witness people walk down a road that's really difficult. And I'm grateful that you gave me the air cover to walk through something tough tonight. But there's a hope that we have in Jesus because he's given us promises to cling to. Jesus is the one that chases the 99, who, by the way, used to be a part of the 100. Jesus is the one who tells a story of a father running to a son that ran away. They're loved and they're not outside of the sight of God. The people that you are worried about, the ones that you have read the stories of, I'm not coming back. Jesus doesn't abandon his people. He came, died for the forgiveness of the transgressions of the people that you are worried about. They are not the God of their salvation. Better yet, you don't have to be the God of their salvation either. So understand that there's a king over all of this, that he has promised that he will see his people home, that they are not outside of his mind, outside of his sight, and he is not too busy to go chase down the sheep again for the first or the 1,000th time. We can trust our Father. He is the shepherd that watches over his flock. And again, if you're in here and you're walking through that season, I hope you don't feel talked about, but talked for. That you don't feel like you've been talked over, but that you feel represented by what we're talking about and heard. I would just echo the words of Eugene Peterson when he quotes Jesus. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Then come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn unforced rhythm of grace again. That's on the table for you tonight. Jesus isn't calling you to give what you don't have. He can handle your questions, and he created the church to love you through them, even if you haven't seen that recently. So whatever small step it is, whether it's just meeting with Christian friends, whether it's being honest in a small group, maybe it's Kairos on a Tuesday night or a Sunday morning, Jesus is there with you, and he's promised to walk with you the entire way. So don't push that aside. Verse 35 says, don't throw aside your confidence, which has great reward. We're clinging to promises. In church, we can help cling to promises with those that we love. Our story isn't marked by our doubts, our fears. They're marked by his wounds and his righteousness. We have assurance that he will not let us go. Our Father will come welcoming us every single time, that we are not too far gone. And all of us who believe, no matter what our story is, are secure in him, because he is the one who is faithful. And we will all be able to cling to that promise. for the first, the 1,000th time. Amen. Amen. Y'all, thank you for hanging with me in a tough topic. This could have been a lot longer. My 17-part series is coming to YouTube soon. But thank you for hanging with me. I know it is, it's a tough situation, but God's good through it. We're going to enter a time called 120 seconds. Basically, what this time is a chance for us to listen in to what the Father might have had for us tonight. We don't serve a dead God. We don't talk about God like he's not here. He is here speaking to us. So if something in this message provokes something in you, now's a great time to pray and think about it. Now's a great moment to consider what it is that might have had your name on it tonight. If you need some questions, something really hands-on and applicable, here are a couple. Who comes to mind when you think of the de-churched? What's the name? Who's the face? And then what's one step that you can take towards building trust with that person again, whether it's between you and them and the church, or this person and Jesus? What's one way that we can reach out and say, hey, come to the table and sit, stay a while? There's something worthwhile here. Next is this. If you're someone walking through a tough season, like we've described, what's one step that you can take? Wounded, skeptical, confused, distrusting. What's one step that you can take towards safe and healthy biblical community? It doesn't have to be drastic. What's one way that we can walk towards the body and hopefully find healing? So let's listen in together. Your Father has something to say to you tonight. He's not a silent God. Trust him with the answers. Trust him that there's grace to cover the wrongs. And commit yourself to obedience walking forward. Let's listen in together.